Okay, good evening, everybody. It's Wednesday night, so it's Halacha and Tanya. We're in the middle of the laws of Muktzeh. Last week, we were learning the dinim of Muktzeh machmas atzmei. That means it's not considered a utensil. It's not considered anything, and therefore, as it's called in Halacha, Muktzeh machmas gufay is just inherently Muktzeh. Okay, we left off in the middle of it, and the dinim of buttons. Now, if buttons, let's say, fall off from a jacket, blouse, whatever. So there are opinions that say that if you're planning to put the button back onto the garment, so then it's not muktzeh. Other people, and that's the way Bais Din learns, that even then, really buttons that fall off from a garment should be treated as muktzeh. So therefore, they need, if you're planning to, a button falls off on Shabbos, you have to just leave it there where it fell. You can move it off to the side with it, kicking it a little bit. But the bottom line is, it actually remains muktzeh. Broken dishes, with again, just reviewing the end of last week's class. Broken dishes, if they're not usable, they're muktzeh. Broken eyeglasses, if you can't wear them as they are, then it's muktzeh. Otherwise, it's not muktzeh. If you have a sewing needle that broke, normally a sewing needle is keli shemalachti le'isr. Now we learned you can move it for you need the place, you need something to use it for. But if a needle broke, the eye of the needle broke, so then it's not a keli anymore. It's completely muktzeh. Okay. Now this is where we are now. So doorknobs or anything, light switches, faucet handles, anything that falls up on Shabbos becomes completely muktzeh. You're not allowed to move it for any reason whatsoever. The only time you can move it, we said, if it's in a dangerous situation, a glass broke and it's in the place where somebody, God forbid, can get hurt, so then you're allowed to pick up the muktzeh and move it. In fact, another interesting point, even if a mezuzah, let's say, fell off in Shabbos, technically, that mezuzah is muktzeh. It fell off from the building. It was attached to the building, now it fell off. But if it's going to be defiled, let's say it fell on the floor, so then you're allowed to pick it up and put it away, that it shouldn't be defiled. But if it fell down onto a table, onto a counter, technically that mezuzah is actually muktzeh. Okay, now, what happens if somebody has old clothing or soiled clothing, even though they're dirty, that you're not able to wear them, or discarded clothing that you threw into the garbage, an old piece of clothing you threw out in the garbage before Shabbos. So then the din is it's not muktzeh because they're really garments. If somebody threw out a broken plate before Shabbos, then they're showing it's not a plate. If it's not a plate, then they're throwing it out. Then if they threw it out before Shabbos, you cannot retrieve it on Shabbos from the garbage because it's muktzeh. But if it's clothing, dirty clothing, or discarded clothing, they're not muktzeh at all, and you can take them out of the garbage. Okay, the next part of these dinim, I'm pretty sure we did not learn them about foods that are edible and non-edible foods. If edible foods are muktzeh, non-edible foods if they're muktzeh. These are very, very practical dinim because they apply basically to things you have in your freezer and to other things like that. Anything which is edible for humans or for dogs is not muktzeh. But if it's human food, then you're not planning to give it to a dog, and it's not edible for the person, then it's muktzeh. And we'll see examples of that as we go on. Anything that's edible and you're planning to give it to a dog is not muktzeh. If it's human food, it's not muktzeh. Okay? Now, if it's human food that's not edible for a human, it's edible for a dog, and you're not planning, though, to give it to a dog because it's too expensive or whatever, so then it becomes muktzeh. Now, what is considered edible and non-edible? Foods which are eaten sometimes, foods that are eaten sometimes by people, not always. So they're not considered muktzeh. For instance, the classic example they give, raw eggs seemingly are not normally eaten. But people do eat raw eggs. Chazanim eat raw, it's goggle-muggle, you make this with sugar, whatever. It's supposed to be good for the voice. So therefore, eggs, even raw eggs, are sometimes eaten. So therefore, raw eggs are not muktzeh. Unless we own a farm, but eggs laid on Shabbos, Yom Tov, are muktzeh for a different reason. But if you have a chicken and laid an egg on Shabbos or Yom Tov, that egg is muktzeh for the duration of Shabbos. Now, where do we get these practical cases? Raw meat. Now, again, it's not Kabbalah. Foods that are eaten, even though most people don't eat it, but it's eaten by a lot of people, that is called edible. In the time of the Gemara, people ate raw meat. They used to chew on raw meat. They used to eat raw meat. Therefore, in the time of the Gemara, raw meat was not muktzeh. Even though most people cooked the meat, broiled the meat, baked them, whatever, but it was still edible raw. And therefore, in the time of the Gemara, raw meat was not muktzeh. Later, poskim write nowadays that we don't eat raw meat, generally speaking. Then raw meat is muktzeh. Raw fish, and again, this is a lot depends on the changes of the times. Yeah, in certain places they eat raw fish. Sushi, for instance, many times is raw fish. If people will start eating raw fish, then raw fish will not be muktzeh. But if people don't eat raw fish, they don't eat raw meat, so then that becomes muktzeh. Where is this a very practical case? It's very simple. If you have, I'll give a classic example. You have ice cream in your freezer. Okay, it's in the back of the freezer. And in front of it, you have raw meat, raw chicken. Okay, now that raw meat and chicken is muktzeh, completely muktzeh. You can't move it because you need the place, because it's not keli shemalachtel iser. A vessel's primary use is for something forbidden. We learned you can move it if you need the place. So if you have stuff that's muktzeh because it's designated for forbidden things on Shabbos and is blocking your ice cream, yeah, you would be allowed to move it. But raw meat, raw chicken, raw fish, in that assumption, meanwhile, that is inedible and therefore they're muktzeh. So you have a big problem. You can't move the meat or the chicken out of the way with normal movements to get to the food, to get to the ice cream. Or you have whatever it may be. I'm just giving an example of ice cream. If you have other stuff that's in the freezer and blocking it are foods that are inedible and therefore they're muktzeh, so therefore they're muktzeh completely and you can't move it for any reason. Now you might be able to move it away a little bit with your elbow, but then what's going to happen is going to fall out of the freezer and then you have another problem.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
Aren't most frozen foods usually raw? I mean, that you can't be eaten.
No, I'll give you that. No, I'll tell you what I was going to say this in a minute or two. Let's say somebody baked the roast or chicken and they're not using it for a week or two. So they put it in the freezer. That freezer, or baked bread in the freezer, right? Baked bread, people freeze bread, people freeze milk. Stuff that's edible and frozen is not muktzeh on Shabbos because all you have to do is take it out and defrost it and it's edible. Raw meat, raw fish, things that are raw and you can't cook on Shabbos. For instance, interestingly, on Yom Tov, raw meat and raw chicken and raw fish are not muktzeh. Because on Yom Tov, you're allowed to cook it. If you're allowed to cook it on Yom Tov, then the food is edible. You can cook it. But Shabbos, you're not allowed to cook. So if you have raw meat, raw fish, raw whatever, that's inedible, okay? Then it's in the freezer and it's blocking ice cream or whatever, food that you want to get for Shabbos, a cake, whatever. So then you wouldn't be allowed to move it because it's completely muktzeh. Now, raw fish, again, it depends what the custom is. If people are going to start eating raw fish, like we said before, sushi, then it's possible raw fish won't be muktzeh. If it's a fish that nobody eats raw, if it's that a particular type of a fish that people don't eat in sushi, people don't eat it raw, that fish would be muktzeh because that particular fish is raw and it's not edible. But for instance, smoked fish, herring, they're edible. So even though they're not cooked, they're just pickled or smoked or whatever. So again, then they're still not muktzeh. But now we're coming into another practical dinam of inedible food. Raw dough, raw beans, raw rice, vegetables that are not eaten raw and are raw. All these types of things, because they're not edible, they're completely muktzeh. You can't move them for any reason. You can move them with your elbow, you can move them with your foot, but you can't pick up these things in a regular way for no matter what the reason, unless it's a dangerous situation, we said. Why? Because that food, it's inedible, it's not called a food. If it's not a food, it's completely muktzeh. Like for instance, like we said, uncooked beans, uncooked flour, yeast, uncooked spaghetti, noodles, uncooked. All those things are not edible, so automatically they're muktzeh. Popping corn, when you pop popcorn, but you have to pop it. You have to put it into the microwave. It comes in a bag, it's raw, and then you put it in the microwave and it pops it. So while it's raw, it's muktzeh because it's not edible. And popping, cooking it, you're not allowed to do on Shabbos. So therefore, that would be considered completely muktzeh. Now, I'll give you another example. Fresh vegetables that are not eaten raw, i.e. a potato, or to give other examples over here, sweet potatoes, turnips, all these vegetables are not eaten raw. Nobody eats a raw potato. And therefore, by the way, if somebody does, they make a shahakol on it. You can't make a adama on a raw potato because the only time you make a adama on a vegetable is if it's edible as is. But if it's a vegetable you can't eat raw and you only cook it, then when it's cooked, it's not the normal way of eating it. And if it's not the normal way of eating it, then you make a shahakol. You can't make a adama. But all these foods, because then you have this, it's a common case. You made a cholent on Friday, and you have a leftover potato, raw potato, you didn't use in the cholent, and it was left on the counter. Now comes Friday night, Shabbos morning, you want to put it away, you're not allowed to. Even if you need the place, you're not allowed to move it. A Yom Tov again, because it's edible. The Yom Tov you're allowed to cook. So a raw potato is not muktzeh. Raw beans are not muktzeh. Nothing like that is muktzeh. Now you have certain bones that are not edible. You can have certain meat bones, certain chicken bones that are not edible. Now certain chicken bones, people bite it open and they eat the marrow inside. So those bones are not muktzeh because they're edible. But any peels, any shells which are not edible are muktzeh. That means like this. If you're eating an egg, but this happened in our shul a few weeks ago, by Shalosh Shudas, they were serving hard-boiled eggs. And somebody peeled the egg. And then later, I saw they were playing with the peels. It's right in front of you. People have a tendency of playing with the peel. It was a kid, by the way. So I said to them, by the way, that's muktzeh now. Once you peel an egg, the peel is not edible. So that peel now becomes muktzeh. While it was still part of the egg, so it's bottled to the egg, it's part of the egg, so it's not muktzeh. But once you peel the egg, and therefore there's a old Jewish tradition that the women do, because many Hungarians have on Shabbat ayah mitzvibul. You have eggs with onions. It's a whole Hungarian dish that they make. So what women would do if they're serving eggs, they would peel the eggs right over the garbage can, that the peel falls straight into the garbage can. If you're eating eggs, hard-boiled eggs at the table, and let's say you peel it into a napkin, because what's called gadif sholrei, that we'll learn more dinim about it, to clean off the table, you'd be allowed to take the eggshells in the napkin and throw them out. But you can't play with them, because then you're not cleaning the table, you're playing with them. The same thing, almond shells, in the hard shells of the almonds, walnuts, all these types of nuts that have inedible peels. And even fruits, by the way. Cantaloupe peel is not edible. A watermelon peel is not edible. So all those types of things, after you peel them, you have to throw them straight into the garbage. You're not allowed to play with them, because they're not edible. And they're not edible, they're muktzeh, which is simple halacha over here. In fact, Alter Rebbe says, in Siddur, Alter Rebbe says an interesting thing. He says, on Shabbos, you should not eat walnuts that are in the shell. Why not? He talks about walnuts explicitly, but the part of it applies to all nuts that are in our inedible shell. Now, the Rebbe says when you open a walnut, so there's the skin in between the nuts. When you crack open a walnut, there's this thin skin that's not edible between the nuts, the part, the different parts of the nut. Now, on Shabbos, those are bad, and the peel is good. So on Shabbos, you have to take away the nut from the peel, from the skin. The skin is not edible. So if you want to eat, you're going to have to take away the nut from the skin, and you can't take away the skin from the nut, because then you're separating bad from good on Shabbos, which is one of the lamites malachos, which is forbidden. And then the Alter Rebbe adds, and in addition to that, the peel, the shell of the walnut is muktzeh. And if it's on the table, people have a tendency to play with it. So the first reason really only applies to walnuts, because the other nuts don't have the skin in between the nut. But the other reason, because of muktzeh, that applies universally to any nut that's in a peel, in a shell, that's not edible. So in other words, it would apply to peanuts, pistachio nuts. Now, sunflower seeds, to give you an example, sunflower seeds are not muktzeh on Shabbos. Why? Because people eat the shell. People eat the shell. Pits, the same thing with pits. If you have an avocado pit, nobody eats the avocado pit. So the avocado pit is muktzeh. But for instance, watermelon pits, many people just eat the whole thing. They eat it with the pit. So therefore, watermelon pits that are edible would not be considered muktzeh on Shabbos. But other pits, like peach, plums, all those types of things that the pits are not edible, after you eat it, the pit is muktzeh. So you can take it and clear it off the table if you don't want the mess on the table. But you can't play with it. And if somebody left an empty pit on the counter, if it only had to, if it's a mess and it bothers you and you want to clean it up. But otherwise, you wouldn't be allowed, and give example, olive pits, cherry pits, peach, edible pits are not muktzeh. Now you have the same thing, canned foods. So you have canned foods that the food in the can is edible. If they're edible, they're not muktzeh. even though it's a big halacha question about opening cans on Shabbos, it's a very, very big halachic problem, opening cans on Shabbos. Nevertheless, the can of edible food is not muktzeh. Why? Because while the food is in the can is secondary to the food, and the food is edible. We're talking about food in a can that's edible. So even though you can't eat it on Shabbos technically because it's difficult opening the can, but it's not muktzeh because the can is secondary to the food and the food is edible, so the food is not muktzeh. But if you have raw beans in a can, raw whatever, and foods that are not edible, then they're completely muktzeh on Shabbos, and the can is completely muktzeh on Shabbos. You can't move it for any reason whatsoever. Now, we learned before that things that you want to sell in business are muktzeh. Now we learned the things that is called muktzeh and machnas chasad in kids. Like you want to give back a dress, you're not going to use it because then you won't be able to give it back. So then that's muktzeh because you're planning to give it back. Any appliance that you plan to give back is muktzeh because you're not going to use it because you're going to ruin it. It's the real high level of muktzeh. What about a store that has on the shelf cans of food? Now their plan is to sell it. Or you have in your house, you sell things out of your house, and you have bottles of food, cans of food, whatever. So even though your intent is to selling it, but it's not muktzeh because it's still food that you could eat. Food is different. A person will take if they need the food, the guy will take the food off, the donor will take the food off the shelf and eat it. I mean, if it's edible, so it's not muktzeh. Now, frozen food, again, we said if it's edible, all you have to do is thaw it out, defrost it, it's not muktzeh. If it's frozen food that's not edible as is, then it's muktzeh. Okay? And people have to be very careful. That's a very practical din when you want to take things out of the freezer, or other times also you can have raw flour in a pantry blocking the food that you want to get to. So you wouldn't be allowed to move the flour that's inedible as is, or any other food that's inedible and is behind something, it's in front of something that you want to get to, that you have a problem moving it because it's real muktzeh. You have to move it with an elbow, with thumb, you can't move it the normal way of moving it. Now, next thing over here, same, including the same thing as medicines. Are medicines muktzeh on Shabbos? So, medications that you're allowed to take on Shabbos are not muktzeh. Medications that you're not allowed to take on Shabbos are muktzeh. Now, technically, and see how much time we have just to discuss, so we'll continue with Shem next time. Technically, it's a big problem taking medication on Shabbos. I want to explain why medicines would be muktzeh. The Chachamim made a decree that foods that are made by grinding them up should not be taken on Shabbos because you might come to grind up vegetation, which is one of the 39 biblical halachos in Shabbos. Now, years ago, when people they didn't have pharmacies like today. You go into the pharmacy, the drugstore, and you buy medicine. People used to make their own medicine. How do they make medicine? Most medicines, as we know, are ground up herbs. That's the way the Chinese used to make medicines. That's the way medicines really happen today also. So the Chachamim said that because when you take medication, medicine is made by grinding, Chachamim said you're not allowed to take medicine on Shabbos because you might come to grind herbs, which is biblically forbidden. So the general statement is you're not supposed to take medication on Shabbos. What are the exceptions to the rule? There's a lot of exceptions. So medications that deal with blood pressure and heart conditions and thyroid conditions and all that, there's no shaila. That has to do with pikuach nefesh. It's a life-endangering situation. Medications that you have, let's say, an antibiotic regimen, and it has to be taken for 10 days. So again, halacha says you could take them on Shabbos too. Obviously, if you take it 3 times a day and you could take it once on Shabbos, twice after Shabbos would be better. On Friday, you take it 3 times on Friday rather than Friday night would be better. But technically, certain times medications could be taken. But if you're on a regimen, for instance, according to many opinions, many great Litvish opinions, you're not allowed to take, don't forget, years ago, they didn't have Tylenol, Advil, and all that stuff. They had aspirin. According to many halachic opinions, you're not allowed to take aspirin on Shabbos, Tylenol on Shabbos, Advil on Shabbos. According to many opinions, you're not allowed to. The Chassidish poskim, so Shulchan, the Chassidish poskim are more lenient with these types of medication like aspirin and Tylenol and Advil, and they hold that if you're not feeling well, you have a headache or whatever, you're allowed to take it. You can take it on Shabbos. But the difference is as follows. If you hold you're not allowed to take aspirin on Shabbos, then it's muktzeh. It's not a food. You can't take it. Medicine is not a food. It's a pill you swallow. That's why you don't make a bracha on the pill when you swallow it. It's not a food. If it's something that's you're allowed to take on Shabbos, so then automatically it's not muktzeh. That's the difference in medications. So if you're allowed to, but I'll give an example. If you have a cream, now you're not allowed to put on a cream on Shabbos. You can't smear cream on Shabbos. So therefore, creams that you're not allowed to put on Shabbos are muktzeh, because you can't use them on Shabbos. And it's not a food. What is it? It's nothing. So that would be completely muktzeh. But the marshal, Band-Aids, let's see what the gauze pads, I mean, all those things you're allowed to use on Shabbos. If you're allowed to use it on Shabbos, it's not muktzeh. Sometimes a cream that you can squeeze out of a container, you can't smear on Shabbos. But if you have a tube of cream and you smear it directly onto the little sore, and then you put a Band-Aid over it or gauze over it, that you would be allowed to do. So that medication wouldn't be muktzeh on Shabbos. But if you have, let's say, a tub of Vaseline, the only way you're going to take out Vaseline from that thing with your finger is by smearing it. So that is completely muktzeh because you can't use it for anything. So in that case, when you have a tube of Vaseline, there's no way you could use it on Shabbos, it's completely muktzeh. So again, not only that, medicine bottles that are empty, the container is empty, and you're not planning it to use it for something else. Those containers, because they had medicine in it, so the medicine is muktzeh, the container became muktzeh. So even though they're emptied, they're still muktzeh. If the medicine that you're not allowed to take was in there when Shabbos began, because then it became a basic. Let's say it was emptied on Friday, you'd be allowed to move it on Shabbos. But if when Shabbos began, it had medicine in it that you were not allowed to take, then the container became a base for muktzeh, and then you wouldn't be allowed to move it at all. It is completely muktzeh. Okay, we're going to stop here. We're going to go to Tanya.